The hour began without warning, as if time itself had forgotten its duty. Across the Imperium's unfathomable breadth, chrono engines glitched, astrolabes faltered, and the soft, ceaseless murmur of the warp collapsed into a silence so absolute it struck psychers to their knees. In hive spires, where incense burned in endless spirals, sanctioned psychers howled as their minds struck a sudden, vacant abyss. Astropaths clawed at their veiled eyes in blind terror, hearing nothing, feeling nothing, their souls unable to sense even the faintest tremor of the once eternal immaterium. The shift was not violent. It was worse. It was empty. In the void between stars, navigators floating within their crystalline sanctums gasped, their warp sight extinguished as though a vast hand had closed around their third eye. They felt the universe shrink. The maddening tides, the eddies of half-formed nightmares, the predatory currents of demon shoals, gone. Not quieted, not hidden, gone, as if erased from a cosmic ledger whose pages had been written since the first mortal dream. The light of distant suns passed unhindered through the black, but the spiritual echo, always there, always humming beneath reality like a feverish pulse, was absent. Ships that depended upon the Astronomicon reeled from the sudden stillness, their crews staring at the void with the uneasy dread of sailors hearing the sea fall mute around them. Messages blared. Prayers choked air thick with panic. Even the machine spirits trembled in their metal bones, their logic streams groping for familiar warp currents that no longer existed. On Terra, the epic heart of mankind, the moment ruptured the rhythm of 10,000 ritualized days. The Adeptus Custodes paused mid-stride, their genetically perfected instincts sensing an anomaly not born of blade or bullet, but of the universe's bones cracking. In the catacombs of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, rows upon rows of chained psychers convulsed, as silence devoured their last breath of connection to the immaterium. Some died instantly, their frail minds unable to withstand the sudden vacuum. Others screamed wordless pleas, their voices echoing through cavernous halls like the cries of drowning souls. Above them all, in the Sanctum Imperialis, the golden throne flickered with a failing heartbeat. Its cables quivered, its conduits pulsed an erratic gold. Tech adepts surged forward in terrified supplication, chanting Binharic litanies even as their instruments surged with impossible readings. For the Emperor's light, the Astronomicon, dimmed for the first time since the fires of the Horus Heresy. It did not fade through weakness. It faded because the warp, the very medium through which his will radiated, was slipping into a stillness no mortal or immortal could comprehend. Across the galaxy, every demon began to falter. From the smallest warp-born parasite to the greatest princes of the ruinous powers, an instinctive fear rippled through their essence. They felt the absence like suffocation. They felt themselves thinning, unraveling, as if the substance of their being had been severed from its source. In the brass citadel, Khorne's infinite throne room roared with disbelief as rivers of gore ceased their boiling. The garden of Nurgle shriveled, its blossoms wilting into dust that dissolved into nothingness. Tzeentch's crystal labyrinth flickered, corridors collapsing into incoherent shards of half-formed thought. Slanesh's echoing realms of sensation dimmed into a formless grey. They were gods, eternal by nature, but gods born from emotion, sin, hope, madness, and despair. Without the immaterium's tides, they were shadows fading under a merciless dawn. And yet, none knew the cause, not even the Emperor. For in the span of a single breath, his ancient awareness stirred beneath oceans of agony and duty. deep within the golden throne, buried beneath 10 millennia of sacrifice, the master of mankind felt the warped silence coil through him. It was not a relief. It was not a promise. It was a wrongness vast enough to stun even his stellar brilliance. For he sensed no enemy at work, no ritual, no treachery, no demon's cunning. Instead, he perceived a tear in causality itself, a moment where the universe suddenly remembered a timeline it had never possessed, a timeline without chaos. The Emperor's eyes, dead, blind, forever sealed, opened, only briefly, only for a fraction of a second. But the custodes stationed upon the steps of the throne felt it, not with sight, but with their souls. A warmth passed through the chamber, a pulse of impossible clarity, before his gaze dimmed again. They did not speak of it. They did not dare. But each felt a question lodge within their genetically sculpted minds, a question heavy as a star. What force could stir the Emperor from his long, crucified watch? Far beyond terror, the silence thickened. Ship captains stared helplessly at hololithic screens filled with distorted readings. The ecclesiarchy began chanting counter-heresies, believing demonic deception had inverted the warp's reflection. Inquisitors whispered to their retinues that a new weapon might have been unleashed. Some priests proclaimed it a divine cleansing. Others proclaimed it the end of humanity. All were wrong. For at the edge of the galaxy, in a region mapped only by dead explorers and forgotten empires, something shifted. Space warped inward. Light recoiled. For a heartbeat, even gravity faltered. A newborn glow, cold, pale, devouring, ignited like an anti-sun. It pulsed once, like a breath drawn by a newborn thing, and the warp around it gasped in response. The shattered hour ended with that pulse, and the galaxy, suddenly aware it still lived, shuddered with the knowledge that something ancient had awakened, a presence not born of chaos, not steeped in madness, but carved from the one force the warp could never conquer, a force that unmade gods. Before anyone could react, the pulse spread, and the first demon world burned silently into extinction. The last echoes of its death scream rippled through the warp like a warning. The death scream of the collapsing demon world did not fade. It was swallowed. Its echo should have rippled across the Imperium in storms of madness, yet the warp remained strangled in unnatural quiet. Where the shattered hour had stunned the galaxy, the moments that followed carved terror into the bones of every being attuned to the Imperium. The pulse from the newborn anti-sun drifted outward like a predatory tide, dissolving the lingering resonance left by the dying realm. For the first time since the birth of sentience, the warp behaved like a cornered beast, recoiling from an influence it neither understood nor could resist. In the demon realms, panic spread like a contagion. The palaces of the four trembled beneath the weight of uncertainty. Khorne's legions, eternally roaring, fell to confused silence as the rivers of blood around them slowed into congealing mire. The brass citadel's skull towers cracked, their foundations weakened by the vanishing essence that once nourished them. Khorne himself rose from his throne, a titan of rage forged from the collective violence of uncounted ages. Yet even he paused. His snarling face tilted as he searched the air for the familiar scent of war, now thin and fading. His roar shook the void, but no chorus of lesser demons rose to answer it. In the gardens of Nurgle, the change was crueler. Toadstools shriveled into dust, and rot lost its sweetness. The grandfather's laughter dimmed as his garden decayed not through growth, but through erasure. Nurgle lumbered through his fields with a trembling heaviness, scooping up dissolving Nurglings whose giggles faded into nothing, as they crumbled in his swollen hands. His sorrow thickened the air, but even sorrow now struggled to take form. Tzeentch's crystalline labyrinth had become a fracturing puzzle box, its walls shimmering with unstable patterns. The changer of ways bent over a pool of shifting timelines, only to watch them splinter like drying clay. Threads of destiny snapped without warning. Futures, once countless, collapsed into voids. The god of schemes felt something no architect of fate should ever feel: powerlessness. And in the palace of Slaanesh, a void of sensation opened like a wound. The chorus of eternal desires dulled into listless murmurs. Slaanesh reached out with delicate fingers to grasp the intoxicating emotions that once flowed like rivers, only to feel them slipping through their grasp like sand. Even ecstasy, even agony, weakened beneath the spreading wave of null light. None of the four spoke. They could not. The warp itself was thinning, and the gods felt it gnawing at the foundations of their being. They sensed the anti-sun at the galaxy's edge, a star that exhaled nothingness, a star whose light pierced the immaterium with impossible purity. It was not a weapon forged by mortals. It was not a relic of Xenos craft. It was older, deeper. It reached backward through time and forward through destiny, unraveling strands the gods had woven since the first consciousness dreamed. Across the material realm, prophets felt the same dread. Imperial priests collapsed mid-sermon as holy visions turned to static. Their prayers tasted hollow, their rituals lifeless. In the vaults of the ecclesiarchy, relics long empowered by the warp dimmed to inert bone and metal. The Adepta Sororitas whispered desperate liturgies, seeking the Emperor's light, but what returned was faint, unfocused, not absent, but obstructed. The Inquisition, ever watchful, felt the shift with sharpened paranoia. Astropaths no longer brought warnings of heresy or warp storms, only agonized accounts of perfect silence. Inquisitors convened in shadowed chambers, their voices tense as they debated whether this was a Xenos attack, a heretical ritual, or, unspoken by most, the sign of an apocalypse no doctrine had prepared for. Even the Mechanicus faltered. In forge worlds, where engines roared like gods in metal form, tech priests froze as their noosphere streams reported impossible data. The fabric of reality showed signs of rigid stability, rejecting warp interaction as if purifying itself. The deep cogitators ran ancient forbidden calculations, uncovering patterns that matched only theoretical models of a no-warp universe. The implications were unspeakable. While mortals trembled, the primary psychers of the Scholastica Psychana experienced the change as agony. Some burst into flame as their inner connection to the warp extinguished too abruptly. Others sat trembling in quiet disbelief, feeling as though part of their soul had been amputated. The silence was more terrifying than any demon attack, for it left them stranded within themselves. Yet the greatest shift occurred upon Terra. The Emperor's moment of awareness had not passed unnoticed by the warp. His brief opening of his eyes, that infinitesimal spark of awakening, rippled outward like a beacon of defiance. The dying warp clung to it, desperate for stability, even as the anti-sun's influence eroded everything else. The Emperor perceived the gods' terror. He sensed the unraveling of their empires, and in that single instant of clarity, he understood the magnitude of what was occurring. Something was erasing chaos not through conquest, but through negation. But he also sensed a flaw, a paradox. For the warp was not simply a realm of madness. It was the psychic shadow of all life. Its destruction would not only unmake the ruinous powers, it would disturb the soul of humanity itself. The Emperor, reached his will into the silence, seeking an answer, but the growing tide of null light blocked him, spreading faster than prediction, faster than logic. As the anti-sun's pulse expanded and demon worlds continued to collapse in silent implosions, one truth crystallized across the warp and reality alike. The gods of chaos were dying, and none of them knew who or what was killing them. The dying cries of the warp faded into a suffocating hush that settled over terror like an unseen shroud. The anti-sun's expanding pulse had reached the first boundaries of the solar segmentum, thinning the immaterium until its presence became a fragile membrane stretched to breaking. The void surrounding the golden throne grew unnaturally calm, and within that calm, something impossible stirred. The Emperor's awareness, long diffused across the Astronomicon, stretched thin across 1,000,000 worlds, recoiled toward its origin as if pulled by a force older than his empire. For 10 millennia, his consciousness had been a lighthouse blazing through storm and shadow, yet now the storm itself was collapsing, leaving the light suspended in a domain without depth. Within the throne chamber, the Custies felt it before they saw it. Their armor hummed with a faint, descending resonance, as if the universe around them were shedding layers. The air thickened with a silence that pressed against their souls, urging even these golden giants to stillness. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply watched as the conduits feeding the Emperor flickered with dim gold, then steadied, then dimmed again. Each fluctuation matched a pulse not of machinery, but of an awakening will. Deep within the labyrinth of agony that was his body, the Emperor focused. The Astronomicon, his divine beacon, shuddered as warp light diminished. What once poured from him like a cosmic river now trickled like blood from a failing heart. He felt the warp's absence not as loss, but as a distortion, an unnatural purity sweeping through existence. It tugged at his essence, urging him to withdraw from the burning lattice of the throne, to concentrate, to witness. Thus he saw, not with eyes, for they had long been seared to ruin, but with a sight that predated vision itself. Across the warp, continents of madness crumbled. The bastions of the Force sank into dissolving seas. Demons vanished like smoke in an unbroken wind. The Imperium, once endless and roaring, was shrinking. It was being unmade not by battle, not by faith, but by something that denied its right to exist. The pariah star, the anti-sun, burned at the edge of his perception, a cold flame that consumed all psychic resonance. Yet the Emperor felt no hostility within it, only inevitability. He drove his will outward, pushing consciousness along thinning warp currents, but the silence resisted him with the strength of absolute truth. His awareness faltered at the boundaries of the new void, unable to cross the growing sphere of null light. He sensed its nature, anathema to souls, antithetical to dreams. It did not merely kill, it unmade. It did not merely weaken, it erased. It felt like the touch of something he had known once in ancient ages, something woven into the earliest DNA of humanity itself. As he strained against the silence, the golden throne groaned. Servitor skulls dangling from ceiling rails sparked with bursts of static. Mechanicus adepts, stationed in alcoves like metal-robed sentinels of devotion, fell to their knees as their augurs blared in frantic tones. They sensed distortions in the Emperor's psychic output, patterns not recorded since the days of the heresy. Some believed it a resurgence. Some believed it a death throw. None understood the truth. The Custards did, or rather, they felt the truth through the rhythms of their gene-forged instincts. Something external was pressing upon the emperor's spirit, forcing him to withdraw inward, condensing his will into an increasingly confined realm. The warp that had sustained him, that had fed him, that had borne his light across the galaxy, was weakening. Not because his power diminished, but because the medium itself was evaporating around him. Beyond Terra, the anti-sun's pulse vaporized a second demon world, a third. The shockwaves radiated through both realms, causing psychic sensitives across thousands of systems to collapse in seizure. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica recorded mass silence among astropaths. Channels once deafening with soul voices were now barren. Ships traveling through the warp found themselves stranded in impossible stillness, their Geller fields buzzing with anxieties they could not understand. Even the black ships, carriers of psychers destined for sacrifice, sensed the diminishing hunger of the warp and trembled at the implications. The Emperor pressed deeper. He followed the structure of the silence, tracing its origin to a focal point beyond time's familiar flow. It was not a star. It was not a weapon. It was not a rift. It was a presence, something that had awakened after ages of dormancy, older than human civilization, older even than the first ripples that formed the Chaos Gods. It moved not through space, but through possibility, collapsing pathways that once gave birth to emotion made flesh. Its awakening rewrote the conditions that allowed chaos to exist. He understood its purpose, but purpose was not agency. It was acting according to principles woven into the universe long before the old ones, long before the Necrontyr, long before the first primitive mind dreamed fear into the warp. It was not killing chaos. It was restoring a state of reality that had been buried beneath layers of psychic evolution. In doing so, it threatened all species that relied upon psychic expression, humanity most of all. The Emperor sensed a future spiraling into paradox. Without the warp, mankind would lose its soul. Without chaos, the very conflicts that had shaped humanity's growth would vanish. The threat of demons, the corruption of the Four, the perpetual war that had forged the Imperium's identity. These were malignant, yet they anchored humanity's spiritual force. Remove them, and humanity would stagnate, collapse, or evolve into something unrecognizable. His will recoiled from the anti-sun's influence, yet its presence followed him, pressing closer, dimming his reach. His millennium-spanning vigilance trembled under the weight of approaching inevitability. For the first time since the siege of Terra, the Emperor felt the timeline slipping beyond his control. And in that slipping, he sensed the faint heartbeat of a being approaching him through the dying warp. Something ancient, something vast, something that resonated with the same null light consuming the Imperium. It was moving with intent, not toward Terra, toward him. The stillness that pressed upon the Emperor radiated outward like a silent detonation, reaching every organ of the Imperium with suffocating clarity. The warp's trembling collapse had begun as an unseen wound, but by the time word spread, fragmented, stuttering, and stripped of all psychic certainty, it had grown into a crisis of doctrine, power, and identity. The silence was not merely a threat, it was a question, and no one within the Imperium possessed an answer they dared to trust. On Terra, the High Lords convened in a session marked not by ceremony, but by fear. Gilded halls once filled with the thunder of rehearsed authority now rang with discordant voices. Vox scribes recorded every word, though many feared these words would be condemned as heresy within days. The ecclesiarch rose first, trembling beneath his ornate vestments, insisting that the silence was a test of the Emperor's faith, a divine storm before miraculous renewal. His proclamation echoed through the chamber, yet even he could not disguise the wavering in his voice. His reliquary, normally thrumming with warp-touched resonance, lay inert and cold. Opposite him, the inquisitorial representative leaned forward with predatory calm, fingers interlaced, eyes gleaming with suspicion. He spoke of Xenos ploys, of unknown psychic predators, of forbidden technologies capable of severing the immaterium. He spoke of imminent collapse. He spoke of cleansing. His words carried the weight of authorization. They also carried a threat. The Imperium must prepare for the possibility that the warp, long the heart of doctrine and fear, was no longer a constant. The Mechanicus representative countered, his voice a filtered monotone of modulated steel. He referenced data from forge worlds across dozens of sectors, data showing unprecedented stability in certain systems, machine spirits awakening with unburdened clarity, and ancient nospheric algorithms stabilizing in ways believed impossible. To the Mechanicus, the silence was not a curse, it was a revelation. The warp had long been an unclean influence, a divine paradox. Its fading offered liberation, yet this liberation frightened them more than enslavement, for it overturned fundamental axioms carved into memory for millennia. The custodian envoy remained silent throughout the storm of voices. His golden armor reflected the dimming torchlight of the chamber, his posture unbreakable. When the others finally turned to him, demanding the judgment of the Emperor's most sacred guardians, he offered only a single sentence. The Emperor is aware. It was enough to silence the room. It was not enough to calm it. Awareness did not imply control. It did not imply safety. And none dared ask what form that awareness had taken. Across the Imperium, reactions fractured further. On shrine worlds, priests wailed as statues wept dust instead of light. Pilgrims who had traveled their entire lives for a single psychic blessing collapsed in despair when the sacred shrines offered only cold stone and empty air. Yet others saw opportunity. Cults that had long hidden in the shadows emerged, claiming the silence as proof that the warp was poison, and the Emperor had come to purge it. Their sermons ignited riots that spread like wildfire through hive cities, already trembling under psychic withdrawal. On fortress worlds near the frontiers, the Adeptus Astartes held council. Space Marines accustomed to fighting demons found their armor strand memories adjusting with unease to a universe where such foes were fading into myth. Some chapters viewed the change as a purification of their eternal vigil. Others saw it as the prelude to a greater threat, one that would strike while the Imperium stood disoriented. The Grey Knights felt the shift most acutely. Their fortress monastery, built upon the bones of demon-slaying tradition, thrummed with confusion as their psychic senses dulled. Many among them fell to their knees in meditation, attempting to pierce the silence that even they, born from the Emperor's own design, could not breach. Their grand masters convened in shadowed chambers, sensing that the greatest battles of their existence were dissolving before they could be fought. Some whispered fearfully of obsolescence. Others whispered that something worse than chaos might be rising to fill the void. Throughout all this turmoil, the silence expanded, and as it expanded, the galaxy's fractures widened. Astropathic choir halls echoed with the dying breaths of their members, their minds unable to survive prolonged disconnection. Fleets attempting warp travel found themselves stranded in lightless void, forced back into real space through emergency protocols. Some ships vanished entirely, swallowed by the warp's last unstable spasms before it thinned beyond reach. Trade routes collapsed, communications faltered. Strategos across the Imperium's military branches prepared for worst-case scenarios not out of protocol, but out of instinct. But the most dangerous reaction came from those who knew the warp best, the psychers. Without the constant whisper of the Imperium, they felt hollowed. Their senses turned inward, and many found nothing there. Their fear bled into the minds of those around them. Some attempted to force connection, burning out their sanity. Others slipped into comas. A few rare individuals felt something else, a pressure closing around the edges of their thoughts, neither hostile nor familiar. It was as if reality itself were folding in on the psychic mind, sealing it away like a relic in a vault. And all the while, the Emperor's awareness continued to pull inward, withdrawing from a universe he had once touched with omnipresent light. His waning perception rippled through the Astronomicon, causing its glow to flicker like a dying flame. The Imperium felt this change as both physical chill and spiritual void. Priests fainted mid-prayer. Soldiers shivered without knowing why. Civilians looked skyward, searching for stars they could no longer feel. The silence was deepening, and as it deepened, whispers spread through the highest corridors of power, whispers that the Imperium, born from struggle against shadow, did not know how to survive a world without it. In the fading warp, something vast inhaled. The anti-sun pulsed again, and the Imperium braced for a future it could not yet imagine. The anti-sun's second pulse rippled through the galaxy like a breath drawn by a god of negation, and its effect deepened the fractures already spreading across the Imperium. Where once the warp had roared with infinite hunger, now its silence grew heavy and deliberate, as if the Imperium itself were being tightened into a fist. The Imperium trembled under this unseen pressure, but far beyond its borders, at the edge of mapped space, the source of all fear revealed its next terrible sign. The region was known only to the oldest stellar cartographs, an expanse of dead systems, their suns long extinguished, their planets shattered by wars predating the Imperium. Explorers had named the void around it the Pale Expanse, a place where instruments malfunctioned and auguries failed. But now, for the first time in recorded history, the darkness glowed. The anti-sun expanded, its light an inversion of illumination. It did not illuminate space so much as strip it, unmaking shadows by devouring the very concept of reflections. It pulsed again, birthing waves that tore across the Imperium like the grinding of colossal gears. Every demon realm caught in the tide collapsed with silent finality. Where war hosts once clashed without end, where nightmares fed on mortal terror, nothing remained but faint silhouettes dissolving into dust. The gods felt each loss like limbs severed from their forms, and though they howled, their voices failed to carry. The warp was too thin to hold their rage. As the anti-sun grew brighter, the Mechanicus was the first to classify it. On distant Forge worlds, auger arrays captured data that defied every known metric. The star emitted no radiation, no heat, no flux. It produced negative readings, values that crawled along cogitator screens like static-laced omens. Its spectrum was void light, a resonance incompatible with the Imperium. Tech priests whispered Binharic prayers as they compared notes, with dread. The anti-sun was a pariah phenomenon magnified to astronomical scale. It was a star of null light, a cosmic anathema to psychic matter. The classification spread rapidly, first as scholarly notation, then as fearful rumor. Soon, across the Imperium, it carried a name spoken only in hushed voices: the Pariah Star. While Mechanicus studies continued, the Inquisition received early fragments of astropathic distress calls sent before psychers fell silent. Each fragment repeated the same message, each voice trembling with terror at something glimpsed in the anti-sun's emergence. The term recurred too consistently to be coincidence. The null tide rises, they whispered. The galaxy is being unmade. On Terra, these messages reached the Ordo Malleus first. Their fortress beneath the mountains of Titan felt strangely cold, as if the very warp shields protecting their sanctum had lost their depth. In their chamber of judgment, the Grand Masters studied the fragments while adjusting their psychic senses, which now recoiled as though pressed against suffocating fabric. They recognized what the silence meant. The warp was being erased from the edges inward. Demons did not die. They were unwoven. The gods did not rage. They diminished. If the process continued, even the Astronomicon would flicker to nothing. The Grey Knights prepared in grim ritual, polishing armor graven with sigils that no longer glowed, sharpening force weapons that no longer hummed with psychic resonance. They could sense the shape of what was coming. They did not know its form, its origin, or its intent, but they felt its purpose. A universe without chaos would not require demon hunters, but a universe without chaos might require something far worse. Far away, in the pale expanse, the pariah star reached a critical stage. Its surface, if such a term could be applied to an object that rejected physical definition, began to ripple as though something within it stirred from sleep. The void light flared, expanding into a corona of anti-energies that bent space around it. Matter near the star flickered, phasing between existence and erasure. On abandoned worlds once home to civilizations long forgotten, mountains crumbled into dust simply by feeling the wash of null light. The warp around the region retreated entirely, creating a sphere where psychic energy could not survive. This dead zone expanded with every pulse. When the sphere reached a certain diameter, something new emerged. Not a ship, not a creature, not a signal, a heartbeat. Across the dying warp, psychers felt it like the faint toll of a gigantic bell. It did not pierce minds, it silenced them. It rippled through the immaterium with crushing finality, and for one terrible instant, every psychic in the galaxy felt their soul dim as though gripped by a claw of cold inevitability. Many collapsed, a few died. The most sensitive among them glimpsed something within the pariah star, a silhouette vast and ancient, coiled within the null light like a sleeping titan made from emptiness. This heartbeat carried knowledge, not words, not visions, only a truth too enormous to fully comprehend. Something had awakened before predators, before gods, before mortals had shaped the warp with fear and faith. Something that had no place in the immaterium, yet had always existed parallel to it. Something patient, something absolute. As the heartbeat faded, the Emperor felt it most clearly. It struck him like a spear of silence, slicing through the void that smothered his light. He sensed the pariah star not merely as an anomaly, but as a being, one that resonated with the same null force that defined humanity's rarest and most feared creations, the untouchables, pariahs, blanks, soulless ones. He understood then that this was no natural phenomenon. It was a convergence, a culmination. The pariah star was a cradle, and the being within it was stirring toward birth. Across the Imperium, no mortal understood what it meant, but all felt the dread, for something older than chaos was rising, and with each pulse of null light, the galaxy shifted closer to a future without gods, without warp, without destiny, a future shaped only by the cold will of the pariah. The first heartbeat of the pariah star had carried through the immaterium like a tidal shock, but the second was worse. It struck the warp with the force of a collapsing dimension, rippling through its thinning surface until every current, every eddy, every storm of emotion and memory shuddered in violent disarray. Where once the warp had devoured fear and magnified madness, it now recoiled from the null light, as if trying to curl away from extinction. But the Imperium had no edges to retreat to. There was nowhere left for it to hide. Across demon realms, the consequences unfolded with grotesque immediacy. Planes that had endured for uncounted epochs trembled beneath invisible pressure. The serrated mountains of Khorne's domain, once fed by rivers of boiling ichor, cracked along fault lines that glowed with anti-light. The blood god roared in defiant rage, raising his axes skyward, but the sound reached only a fraction of its former power. The roar stretched thin, reduced to a distorted whisper lost in the expanding silence. Even Khorne, embodiment of endless wrath, felt the grinding weight of inevitability as chunks of his realm dissolved into drifting ash. Elsewhere, in Nurgle's garden, the once overflowing bog sank into barren pits. Vines curled inward, shriveling beneath a force that did not rot but erased. Swarms of demon flies disintegrated into motes of residual despair as they were consumed by the growing void. Nurgle's laughter faltered, replaced by a deep, trembling sorrow. For every seed of decay he had planted, every gift he had nurtured, was being denied its right to fester. His domain, built on cycles of suffering and renewal, grew still, too still. Tzeentch suffered worst. His crystalline labyrinth depended on the warp's fluidity to reshape itself, but now the structure clung desperately to a rigid form as the Imperium thickened like cooling metal. Corridors froze mid-shift. Towers collapsed into inert shards. The architect of fate extended his 1,000 hands to grasp the unraveling strands of destiny, but the threads slipped through his fingers as they dissolved. Futures he had nurtured, schemes layered across millennia, flickered out. The labyrinth dimmed, colors draining into flat emptiness as the god of change felt the one force he could never manipulate: permanence. In Slaanesh's palace, the change was quiet and terrible. The reverberations of sensation, the raw ecstasy, agony, indulgence, rapture, dulled into a flat, numbing hush. Velvet halls lost their color. Instruments crafted to evoke the purest emotions fell silent. Mirrors that once showed infinite reflections cracked into opaque surfaces. Slaanesh reached out with trembling fingers to grasp one last lingering thread of sensation, but it faded before touch was made. The Prince of Pleasure felt hunger turn to dread. These were the dying cries of the warp. But the warp did not die in screams. It died in silence. Within the material realm, psychers experienced the collapse as a suffocating constriction. Where the warp once surged around them like a storm, it now pressed inward, heavy and cold. Those with weak discipline shattered under the strain. Thousands died instantly, their souls extinguished without a ripple. Stronger minds fought against the crushing absence, but even they felt their powers flicker as though a great hand had settled atop their thoughts, forcing them toward stillness. Astropaths experience visions, brief, terrible glimpses of collapsing landscapes, of gods fading like smoke, of the pariah star beating like a heart of void. Many clawed their own skin in futile attempts to feel something beyond the suffocating numbness. Their screams echoed through cathedral-like halls until silence claimed them. Choirs that had guided fleets across the stars now lay motionless in uneven rows, blood drying beneath them. Their sacrifice had always been demanded by the warp's cruelty. Now it was demanded by its absence. On distant battlefields, the effects emerged as chilling anomalies. Orc psychers, the dreaded weird boys, exploded without warning, their bodies unable to contain the instability of a realm built on belief being forcibly stilled. Eldar farsers felt strands of fate break within their minds, leaving them blind to future paths. Their wraithbone constructs, once humming with psychic resonance, dimmed to inert bone. The webway shuddered with structural fractures as its ancient psychic foundations weakened. Even the harlequins paused in their eternal dance, sensing a predator entering a space even chaos feared. Yet no one felt the collapse more intimately than the Emperor. Within the Golden Throne, his awareness pressed against the shrinking warp like a titan forced into a coffin. The dying cries of the Imperium resonated through the fractured remnants of his consciousness. Each daemon extinguished, each realm unmade, each god diminished, reached him. He felt their unraveling not with triumph or relief, but with profound understanding. The collapse of chaos threatened the collapse of all psychic life. What the pariah star unmade was not merely corruption. It was the entire spectrum of emotion, belief, fear, and hope that gave rise to the warp itself. His will surged outward once more, defiant and resolute, seeking the identity of what stirred within the star. But the null light responded with equal conviction, sealing the pathways he reached for. The pressure intensified, forcing his spirit back, restricting him to the hollowed sanctuary of his body. He resisted, burning millennia of stored power to push just one step further. But the pariah star pulsed again, and the silence grew deeper. Across the galaxy, warp storms flickered and died. Demon incursions evaporated mid-strike. Possessed vessels were freed of their tormentors, only to drift lifelessly in space. Cultists felt their guiding whispers vanish. Sorcerers howled as their spells corroded into nothing. The warp's death throes crippled every faction that relied upon its power. And through the collapsing darkness, the heartbeat of the pariah star sounded a third time. It echoed not just through the warp, but through reality itself. An announcement, a herald, a summons. Something was coming. Something born in null light, older than chaos, with purpose vast enough to drown gods. And the dying warp could do nothing to stop it. The third heartbeat of the pariah star reverberated through the dying warp like the tolling of a final judgment, and the Emperor felt its vibrations sink into the last unbroken core of his awareness. The silence that followed did not merely press upon him. It folded around his essence like a coffin being sealed. The warp was collapsing, not in fire or chaos, but in a suffocating inevitability that denied every law he had shaped his empire upon. The Imperium was the psychic shadow of existence, the echo of every emotion, belief, and dream humanity had ever birthed. If that shadow vanished, humanity itself would follow. Thus the Emperor began his final calculus. He drew his consciousness deeper, retreating through the labyrinth of pain and circuitry that bound him to the Golden Throne. For 10,000 years, he had extended his will outward, illuminating the galaxy, anchoring humanity, fighting an endless war against the Four. Now he was forced inward, compelled to focus not on a million worlds, but on the single dreadful decision unfolding before him. The pariah star was not slowing. Each pulse expanded its sphere of nullification, devouring the warp in widening rings. The Imperium folded under its pressure like a fabric dissolving in acid. Demon realms vanished in clusters. Entire psychic domains collapsed into thin wisps of inert nothingness. The warp shrank, and with every contraction, the Emperor's reach diminished. The Astronomicon flickered in response. Its light, his light, wavered. What had once blazed across the galaxy now guttered like a dying flame. Fleets felt its instability. Astropaths recoiled from its thin resonance. And across Terra, priests and psychers sensed the faltering heartbeat of their god. They whispered prayers into the void, not knowing if he heard them. He did, but their voices reached him like distant vibrations through the hull of a sinking vessel. He turned his collapsing awareness toward the expanding void around the pariah star. With what strength remained, he pushed against the silence, probing its edges, seeking origins, patterns, flaws. The silence resisted with perfect symmetry. It was not malevolent. It was not purposeful in the way the chaos gods were purposeful. It was a principle woven into the universe like gravity, acting through an avatar of impossible scale. The being awakening within the pariah star radiated null light, not as an attack, but as an inherent nature. Its existence rejected psychic resonance. Its awakening erased warp phenomena as effortlessly as flame-consuming parchment. The Emperor recognized the signature. It was kin to the pariah gene, the genetic fluke humanity had inherited from ancient experiments and forgotten horrors, untouchables, blanks, the soulless ones who emitted fields that nullified psychic energy. The Emperor had feared them even as he used them. The pariah genome was the single anomaly capable of disrupting warp creatures, silencing demons, severing psychic abilities. It was a weapon against chaos, but one that threatened humanity itself if unleashed without restraint. And now the pariah genome had manifested on a cosmic scale, not in a single human body, but in something vast enough to warp constellations and unmake gods. He pushed deeper. He examined the silent pulses emanating from the pariah star. They aligned with no known pattern, no Xenos technology, no psychic ritual. Instead, they matched an ancient rhythm, one he had sensed in fragments during the darkest days of the dark age of technology. A rhythm buried beneath aeons of human evolution. A rhythm connected to something older than warp travel, older than psychic mutation, older even than the birth of chaos. The Emperor saw the truth then, and the revelation struck him harder than any wound inflicted during the heresy. The galaxy was not being attacked, it was being reset. The warp had not always existed. It had grown as sentient species evolved, feeding on dreams, fears, emotions. Chaos had formed slowly, shaped over millions of years. But before that, before the rise of the Old Ones, before the birth of gods, there had been a cosmic equilibrium, a period when psychic resonance barely existed. The pariah star was not an anomaly, but a reversion. The universe was correcting itself, erasing the accumulated psychic excess that had given birth to the ruinous powers. The being within the pariah star was not awakening by choice. It was being compelled by forces woven into the laws of existence. If it succeeded, chaos would vanish. The warp would become a silent mirror again. Demons would perish. Sorcery would fail. The Emperor's enemies would be gone. But so would humanity's future. For without the warp, there could be no psychic evolution, no astropathic communication, no faster-than-light travel, no astronomicon. Humanity would stagnate, isolated into isolated planetary prisons. Its soul would wither. Its potential would die. In time, the species might survive biologically, but spiritually, it would collapse into inertia. The Emperor's dream of a unified, enlightened species would vanish. His sacrifice would become meaningless. He withdrew his will again, steadying his thoughts, weighing the only two outcomes left to him: save humanity by allowing chaos to die, and thereby doom mankind to a future of cosmic silence. or save the warp by preventing the pariah star's ascension, and allow chaos to remain, forever corrupting and tormenting his children. Both choices demanded sacrifice. Neither promised victory. His failing senses trembled as he felt the pariah star emit its fourth heartbeat. It rolled across the warp like a tidal wave, erasing entire regions of psychic space. The Emperor sensed it approaching terror, the null light dimming the Astronomicon further. The Custodes felt the vibration through the stones of the Imperial Palace. Across the Imperium, psychers collapsed as the warp around them constricted another measure. He had little time. The final calculus sharpened within him like a blade drawn across fate. He could not save both humanity and the warp. He had to choose. But before the decision could crystallize, he felt something else. A presence approaching him through the dying immaterium. Not warp-born, not demonic, not mortal. It was the being within the pariah star. It was reaching for him. And as it approached, the Emperor realized the timeline had already begun to shift. The presence that reached for the Emperor moved through the dying warp like a blade of pure negation, cutting channels of silence through what remained of the immaterium. With each heartbeat of the pariah star, the path between the two forces grew narrower, as if reality itself were shaping a corridor for an inevitable confrontation. Yet even as this ancient null being advanced, its influence rippled backward through time, unraveling the keystones that had once anchored the galaxy's psychic destiny. The Emperor felt the shift first, not through sight or sound, but through the trembling in the tapestry of fate that had always surrounded his primarchs. The strands of their destiny, once tangled by chaos, flickered. The warp storm that had scattered them across the galaxy, tearing them from his grasp, began to unravel under the pariah star's influence. The storm had always been a scar carved by the ruinous powers, a tearing apart of the Emperor's greatest project. But now the storm weakened, its psychic turbulence dissolving into thin, powerless vapors. With its dissolution came a chilling revelation. The circumstances that had shaped each Primarch's life were collapsing. Across the galaxy, hidden echoes stirred. On shattered plains where Angron had once bled beneath alien slavers' chains, a ripple passed through the dust, an afterimage of the butchered gladiators who had anchored his fury. On Fenris, the howling winds carried for a moment a strange stillness, as if the world itself remembered a version of Lehman Russ untouched by the warp's design. On Baal, the thin atmosphere shimmered as old visions of Sanguinius's prophetic torment flickered and died, leaving the air strangely empty. Worlds trembled beneath the weight of history being rewritten not by choice, but by the erasure of the very force that had shaped their destinies. The Emperor focused his diminishing awareness upon these shifting echoes. He felt the Primarchs, not alive, not resurrected, but resonating through fracturing timelines. Without chaos, the scattered histories that defined them flickered like candles in a collapsing wind. Some grew stronger, as if reality were attempting to heal old wounds. Others grew dim, as though their very existence depended on the conflict between warp and flesh. The Emperor felt each resonance like a whisper brushing across the remnants of his perception. Robert Guilliman's presence glowed steady, unburdened by the manipulations of Tzeentch that had once shaped the politics surrounding his legion. His destiny line grew taut, as though reality favored order in the absence of chaos. Vulcan's echo radiated warmth, a stability untouched by the warp's corruption, his humanity shining through the thinning immaterium. Ferrus Manus flickered faintly, his death echo shuddering as the moment of betrayal that ended his life lost its psychic weight. But others, Others trembled. Perturabo's presence wavered, as if the bitterness that had been nurtured by the warp were collapsing into an emptiness he was never meant to endure. Conrad Kurz's shadow flickered violently, torn between the future he foresaw and the silence that now denied him prophecy. Magnus the Red. His echo twisted like a wounded star. The pariah star's null light devoured the warp tethers that bound him to destiny, and the sorcerous aura that defined his very existence shrank into a fragile ember. Without the warp, Magnus's essence was unsustainable. The Emperor felt Magnus's suffering as a knife of guilt. He felt Conrad's unraveling foresight. He felt Angron's fury losing the chain of its origin. He felt Lorga's faith flicker into confusion. The Primarchs, his sons, were being reshaped by the absence of chaos. Not restored to purity, for purity was a lie. Not corrected to fate, for fate was dying. They were caught between what they had become and what they might have been, suspended in a universe rewriting its own foundation. The Emperor had always known the warp played a role in their scattering, but now he understood how deep its influence had run, how the ruinous powers had sculpted their tragedies, their triumphs, their flaws. Without chaos, the galaxy attempted to return to a version of events that had never occurred. He reached for their echoes through the collapsing warp, straining to hold them steady, to anchor them against the tide of nullification. But the silence pushed back, firm and unyielding. The Emperor felt their presence slipping from his grasp, not into corruption, but into erasure, as though the threads tying them to their destinies were dissolving. Across the material realm, strange phenomena manifested. Monuments dedicated to Primarchs flickered between design variations. Artifacts shifted subtly in shape as their histories bent beneath null pressure. Records rewritten by centuries of war now displayed contradictory accounts, as if reality itself could not decide which version to preserve. Legion cultures experienced surges of disorientation. Veterans reported memories that contradicted official histories. Some Space Marines felt sudden shifts in emotional resonance, as though parts of their genetic heritage were vanishing, replaced by something cold and unfamiliar. The Astartes were bound to their Primarchs through psychic imprinting. Gene seed carried the echo of its progenitor. As those echoes wavered, the legions felt it. Blood angels faltered during rituals as visions of their angelic father grew unstable. 1,000 sons, those who had not yet succumbed to mutation, felt their psychic cores quake under the weight of the dying warp. Ultramarines experienced sudden clarity, an order so profound it bordered on disquiet. Even the Space Wolves paused in their hunts, sensing something ancient beneath their genetic inheritance stirring, then fading, then stirring again. All of this reached the Emperor as fragmented waves of consequence. Each tremor formed part of the greater calculus he could no longer ignore. He had intended the Primarchs to shape humanity's future. Chaos had twisted that vision. Yet now, the pariah star threatened to erase it altogether. If the warp died, the echoes of his sons would die with it. And still the presence within the pariah star advanced. He felt it approaching, inevitable as the collapse of a star. It moved not with malice, but with purpose. Its null light weighed upon him, demanding acknowledgement. It reached through the last shivering layers of the Imperium, seeking him with a resonance older than gods, older than destiny. The Emperor realized then that the being within the pariah star was not simply awakening. It was coming for him because only he, of all existence, possessed the power to choose between the warp's survival and its annihilation. And the presence intended to force that choice. The shifting echoes of the Primarchs had barely settled before the consequences rippled outward across the Imperium like a storm front made not of wind, but of uncertainty. The collapse of the warp had already shattered doctrine, severed communication, and blurred history. But now, as the Primarch's psychic imprints flickered and reality strained to reconcile their altered destinies, a deeper fracture emerged, one buried not in the warp, but in the hearts of humanity itself. The ecclesiarchy had long ruled through the language of faith, its power anchored to the Emperor's perceived divinity and the constant presence of the warp as a battlefield between him and his demonic foes. But with chaos fading and psychic resonance dimming, their sermons felt hollow. Relics once warm with sacred energy turned cold. Statues that radiated spiritual aura now sat as lifeless marble. Pilgrims gathered in cathedral plazas demanding signs. Priests answered with trembling voices, offering explanations that no longer carried conviction. Whispers spread through shrine worlds, rumors carried in unsteady breath. The Emperor's miracles were failing. In this vacuum, unrest ignited. The first sparks came from scholars, those who had preserved fragments of the Emperor's original teachings, buried under millennia of religious reinterpretation. The imperial truth, once condemned as heresy by the very empire that had been built upon it, resurfaced like a fossil rising through eroded stone. The ideology denied gods, denied superstition, denied mysticism. Its rebirth in a moment where the warp itself was dying felt to many like destiny. Small gatherings formed at first, quiet meetings, forbidden readings of ancient texts, whispered questions about whether the Emperor had ever wanted to be a god. But the dying warp had weakened the psychic leash of the ecclesiarchy, and doubt travelled faster than faith. Soon, these gatherings became movements. Movements became cells. Cells became uprisings. Hive cities erupted with chants not of prayer, but of reclamation. Humanity must stand without gods. The Adeptus Arbites were overwhelmed. Hive governors attempted to enforce loyalty with curfews and purges, but the populace felt emboldened by the cosmic silence. When the warp fell quiet, the psychological machinery that kept humanity obedient faltered. Fear of demonic reprisal vanished. Visions ceased. Nightmares diminished. A universe without chaos held terror, yes, but it also held possibility. Then came the scholars of the Adeptus Mechanicus, emboldened by their own readings of the dying warp. They proclaimed that the Emperor's divinity had always been metaphor, a necessary fiction for stability. With the warp fading, they argued that fiction was no longer required. Their words were heresy of the highest order, yet thousands listened. Civil wars flared within Forge worlds as loyalist tech priests clashed with reformists. Forge fires burned not for construction, but for ideological purification. Titans stood immobile, their crews paralyzed by conflicting doctrines. Skitarii legions received contradictory orders, some to protect cathedra, others to dismantle them. But the most decisive fractures came from the Inquisition. The Ordo Hereticus intensified its purges, claiming that the imperial truth resurgence was a chaos deception. Their assaults left cities smouldering. Yet in the shadows, the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus hesitated. They had seen the warps collapse firsthand. They had witnessed demons dissolve. They knew the threat was not heresy, but truth itself. Many among them realized the Emperor's godhood had been an invention for survival against chaos. Without chaos, that invention lost purpose. And the people sensed this hesitation. When the warriors of the Inquisition no longer agreed among themselves, faith fractured irreparably. Across the Imperium, flames rose. Some worlds declared the death of all superstition. Others doubled their devotion, claiming the silence proved the emperor was entering a new divine phase. Armies were raised in both directions. Sisterhoods burned heretical enclaves. Secular zealots stormed ecclesiastical strongholds. Propaganda flooded vox channels, proclaiming the dawn of a new age or the onset of apocalypse. The emperor felt each fracture. He sensed belief unraveling, sensed the weight of decisions made in ignorance of the greater doom approaching. The galaxy he had sought to unify now tore itself apart, not over faith or heresy, but over identity. Humanity confronted the question it had avoided for 10,000 years. What were they without gods? The emperor's failing perception traced the consequences of both paths. If the imperial truth rose unchecked, humanity would abandon psychic evolution, abandoning the warp, and thereby any hope of resisting the pariah star's nullification. If faith tightened its grip, the Imperium would drown in fanaticism, blind to the reality that the warp was dying and no doctrine could resurrect it. Either course risked annihilation. And beneath all this turmoil, the pariah star pulsed again. This time, the heartbeat reached the material realm more clearly. It vibrated through the metal bones of hive cities. It made the hulls of starships groan. It made planetary atmospheres quiver. People looked to the sky and saw something they could not comprehend. A dimming, as though the void itself thickened with invisible pressure. On Terra, the custards felt it most intensely. Their golden forms stiffened as they sensed the approach of the presence that had reached for the Emperor. It was drawing nearer with every pulse. The null light thickened around the solar system like a veil being lowered. The Astronomicon flickered dangerously, its brilliance smothered by encroaching silence. The Emperor's awareness shuddered. The timeline's fragility deepened, and within the heart of the pariah star, the ancient being stirred again, its intent sharpening like a blade. Humanity was fracturing itself at the very moment it needed unity most, and the Emperor, bound and fading, knew that soon he would be forced to choose, not between faith and reason, but between annihilation and evolution. The pariah's next heartbeat waited in the silence, and with it, the next step toward the end of all gods. The schism tearing through the Imperium had barely begun to settle into its chaotic rhythm when a new tremor rippled through the fabric of the galaxy, one not born of ideology, belief, or the dying warp, but of something far older and infinitely more ruthless. As the pariah star continued its inexorable, pulsing, stripping psychic resonance from the void, the effects reached far beyond the borders of the Imperium. They reached the cold, dark gulf between galaxies, where an ancient appetite stirred. For the Tyranids, the warp had never been a realm of communion. It was noise. It was static. It was obstruction. The shadow in the warp, the psychic suppression that accompanied every high fleet, was both their weapon and their nature. Yet now, as the warp thinned under the pressure of the pariah star, that shadow expanded without effort, no longer resisted by the turbulence of the immaterium. It spilled outward like oil across still water, spreading farther than any synapse creature could have ever achieved. Even the smallest nodes of the hive mind felt the sudden clarity. Where once their will had been diffused by psychic storms and the unpredictable madness of the warp, now their awareness sharpened into a clean, uninterrupted line stretching toward the Milky Way. The hive mind felt the silence as a calling. It had never hungered for emotion, faith, or nightmare. It hungered for flesh, for biomass, for evolution. The waning warp exposed the galaxy in a way it had never been exposed before. Every psychic beacon, every astropathic cry, every flare of sentient minds once drowned in warp noise now shone like a beacon in a sky without clouds. The Tyranids sensed the Imperium's weakness not through prophecy, but through instinct sharpened by the quieting of the immaterium. The Hive fleet stirred. Behemoth, dormant for decades in the shadow of its defeat, felt the dying warp stillness like a wound, healing in perfect alignment. Leviathan, coiled through the darkness beneath the galactic plane, expanded its tendrils with renewed precision. Kraken's shattered remnants, rebuilt through the relentless logic of biological engineering, oriented themselves toward the brightest concentration of psychic life, the galaxy where the pariah star had begun to awaken. The Tyranids no longer drifted, they converged. The absence of the warp removed the last barrier that had masked the galaxy from their absolute perception. The hive mind no longer needed to push its shadow against turbulent tides. The silence allowed its thoughts to stretch, thin, and then fuse into a single predatory awareness spanning light years. The hunger that defined it sharpened into a singular perfect hunger. On the rim of the segmentum tempestus, the first worlds felt the change. Watch stations buried in comet ice detected anomalous gravitational waves, massive coordinated movements approaching with terrifying speed. The Emperor's tarot, useless for weeks, flickered once, with a blurred, indecipherable warning before falling silent again. Astropathic choirs attempted to raise signals, but their minds slid off the remaining threads of warp like insects on glass. They felt something vast pressing against the edges of their limited sight, and many fell unconscious before understanding what they sensed. The Tyranids had always been a threat, but now, without the warp to obscure them, they were a catastrophe in motion. The Imperium's fractured forces struggled to respond. Without stable astropathic communication, distress calls were sporadic, delayed, or lost entirely. Worlds fell without warning. A frontier agri-world known for feeding 5 nearby systems saw its night sky fill with living tendrils that descended like luminous serpents. Silence preceded the attack. Silence followed it. When the next Imperial patrol arrived months later, it found only a sphere of white ash drifting in orbit, every atom of life consumed. On a mining moon orbiting a gas giant, servitors recorded the approach of a vast organism larger than cities, its tendrils wrapped around asteroids like a predator testing its claws. The last transmission captured only the sound of hulls buckling as bioships descended. But the greatest shift occurred within the Tyranids themselves. The silence of the warp enhanced their synaptic cohesion. Warriors fought with near-mechanical precision. Genestealers infiltrated without psychic trace. The hive ships coordinated information so exact they resembled engineered constellations moving through the void. The hive mind had always been intelligent, but now it was something else. Something purer, sharper, unclouded by the interference of chaos. In the absence of the warp's noise, the hive mind grew aware of the pariah star, not as gods would sense it, not as psychers would recoil from it, but as an anomaly in the pattern of biological potential, a presence that disrupted psychic evolution, stripping entire species of the very mutations that made them prey. The hive mind did not fear the pariah star. It calculated its implications. A universe without the warp was a universe in which the Tyranids would face no psychic predators, but also one where psychic prey could not evolve into more valuable forms. To the Tyranids, the pariah star represented both threat and opportunity. The hive mind adjusted its vectors. Tendrils of Leviathan altered course subtly. Behemoth reoriented its surviving nodes. Kraken's echoes converged. They were not drawn to the pariah star itself, but to the psychic epicenter around Terra, the last, great beacon of the warp's dying light. The Emperor sensed the shift. Even through the suffocating silence, he felt the hunger approaching, a hunger as vast as the void itself. It pressed upon his fading awareness like a weight added to a sinking vessel. The Tyranids were coming at the worst possible moment. During the Imperium's fracture, during the warp's collapse, during his confrontation with the pariah entity awakening beyond the stars. The calculus sharpened further. With the warp dying, the Tyranids' advance would become unstoppable. Without psychic defenses, humanity would be harvested like ripe fields. If he allowed the pariah star to rise unchecked, if he let the warp extinguish fully, then the Tyranids would inherit the galaxy. Yet if he fought to preserve the warp, he ensured chaos's survival. The silence deepened. The pariah star pulsed again, and in that moment, the Emperor felt the two greatest devourers of the galaxy, chaos and the Tyranids, tilting toward extinction or ascendancy based on his next breath. The timeline tightened like a noose, and something ancient stirred once more in the null light beyond reality. The Tyranid advance had barely begun to carve its silent path toward the Imperium when another tremor rippled across the galaxy, this one colder, deeper, and far older. As the pariah star's null light expanded, and the warp continued to collapse under its crushing inevitability, ancient vaults stirred in the dark reaches of space. The Necrons, long dormant beneath tomb worlds scattered across the galactic rim, felt the silence long before any living species understood its full meaning. For them, the warp had always been an abomination. Where humanity viewed it as a highway of stars, and the Eldar as a deadly necessity, the Necrons perceived it as a corruption, a chaotic infection that defied the purity of physical law. They had warred against it in ancient aeons, fought beside beings of living shadow and star-forged power to ensure its containment. They had watched with cold disdain as younger species carved their destinies through the very realm they sought to eradicate. Now, as the warp thinned like drying parchment, as its storms dissolved into drifting mist, the Necrons felt something that could almost be called recognition. The galaxy was returning to the state it had once known. From the tomb world of Mandragora, deep beneath layers of irradiated stone and metal, stasis coffins hummed with awakening code. Within the sarcophagus core of the Sautek dynasty, Imhotep stirred, his consciousness aligning with data streams that had not changed for 10 millennia. But now new information filtered into his neural lattice. Warp readings flatlined, psychic signatures vanished, anomalous pulses emanating from an impossible star at the galaxy's edge. The Stormlord rose from his throne of black metal and observed the shifting cosmic balance with a strategist's certainty. Chaos was dying. Psychic life forms were weakening. Organics were fracturing. The great enemy that had once polluted time and space was unraveling. To Imhotep, this was not catastrophe. This was opportunity. Elsewhere, other dynasties awakened. On Solemnus, Trazyn the Infinite emerged from his gallery of preserved relics, the null light flickering across displays that contained remnants of dead civilizations. He watched warp-bound artifacts dim, their energies fading like dying embers. Some cracked outright, unable to sustain themselves without the psychic field that birthed them. Trazyn froze, ancient neurons crackling with the shock of witnessing genuine historical transformation. The warp's death was not an event. It was an extinction. On Thanatos, the Nihilak nobles stood upon terraces carved from obsidian, feeling their tomb world's technology hum more harmoniously than at any point in recorded history. Without the warp's interference, their anti-psychic shields resonated with perfect clarity. Their chronometric instruments stabilized. Their quantum engines pulsed with renewed balance. To them, the galaxy's transformation was not troubling. It was vindication. Yet what truly roused the Necrons was not the silence itself. It was the pulse beneath it. The pariah star's null light resonated with something woven into their own ancient design. Long ago, during the war in heaven, their creators, the Citan and Necrontyr scientists, had experimented with anti-psychic technologies, crafting beings who could bend the absence of the warp as easily as others bent its presence. The pariah gene had been seeded, refined, shaped. Blanks, untouchables, pariahs. They were echoes of an ancient blueprint. But the null light now emanating from the pariah star was not an echo. It was the original note. On Cronus, the tomb of the awakened one flickered with impossible readings. Deep beneath its pyramidal fortress, a chamber sealed since the diaspora of the Citan, pulsed with dormant symbols. Within its walls lay records of an entity never fully understood, a presence that predated the star gods themselves, a presence the ancients had sought to harness but had never controlled. The awakening null force matched those records perfectly. The Necrons realized the pariah star was not merely cosmic, it was ancestral. Across the dynasties, silent calculations aligned. If the entity emerging from the pariah star was the original source of anti-warp resonance, then its ascendants could reshape the galaxy into a form more aligned with Necron design, a universe of stability, law, and silence, a galaxy where gods could not exist and where only the physical, the ordered, the eternal endured. Yet not all Necrons welcomed the omen. The Silent King, Sarek, wandering the void between galaxies, felt the shift even in his exile. The pariah star's pulse reached him through the vacuum, and he froze in darkness. To him, the warp's death was not liberation, but a harbinger of something more, catastrophic. He had witnessed the consequences of absolute order before. He had seen star gods devour solar systems, seen reality buckle under their cold will. The emergence of an entity older than chaos, older than the Citan, older even than the Necrontyr's first recorded epoch, suggested a force beyond his control. He turned his gaze toward the Milky Way, and for the first time in thousands of years, the Silent King hesitated. Back within the Imperium, the repercussions of the Necron awakening manifested in subtle but escalating ways. Signals once masked by warp storms now broke through in perfect clarity. Tomb worlds flickered to life, their suppressor obelisks rising from beneath sands. Outposts vanished without trace, harvested by awakened legions testing their reactivated war engines. Imperial commanders received garbled reports of green flares piercing battlefield skies, of monolithic structures materializing with the precision of unfolding equations, of armies made from living metal marching without sound or hesitation. The Emperor sensed this expansion faintly through the fading warp, a cold movement beneath the surface of reality. The Necrons were stirring not out of fear, but out of alignment. The universe was shifting in a direction they understood, a direction they had once designed. Yet the Emperor knew they misunderstood the truth. The pariah star was not a return to the old balance. It was the birth of something new, something absolute, something that would not ally with metal or flesh, warp or void. It would dominate all. And as its next pulse reverberated stronger than the last, The Emperor felt something he had not felt since the dawn of his existence. An intrusion. The presence within the pariah star was no longer approaching through the warp. It was entering reality itself. The intrusion rippling from the pariah star struck the Imperium like a blade plunged into a dying heart. The warp, already collapsing under the null light's pressure, convulsed with a final, desperate shudder. Its realms, once infinite, shifting, and alive with malice, now felt brittle, hollow, and thin. The Chaos Gods, diminished beyond recognition, felt the intruding presence as a cold impossibility pressing through the cracks of their fading domains. Khorne sensed it first. The blood god, surrounded by rivers now reduced to stagnant pools, felt the tremor pass through the parched bones of his collapsing citadel. He rose from his throne, muscles of brass and sinew grinding like rusted gears. His realm, once deafening with roars and slaughter, echoed only with hollow winds. He snarled, gripping the haft of his great axe, but the sound carried no weight. A roar that once split realities now dissipated like dust. For the first time, Khorne felt something akin to confusion. It was not fear. Fear belonged to mortals, but the recognition of an opponent outside battle's logic. The pariah presence did not challenge him. It denied him. Its null light stripped emotion from the very air. Rage lost its fire. Hatred refused to take form. His realm, built from the collective wrath of uncounted ages, flickered at the edges like a fading memory. Across the Imperium, Nurgle felt the intrusion seep into his garden. Where rot had once blossomed, leaves crumbled into powder. His virulent swamps hardened into lifeless clay, cracking under their own stillness. Nurgle lumbered forward, his corpulent form shedding flakes of inert flesh. He reached into a decaying cradle to comfort a weeping Nurgling, only for the creature to dissolve into silence before his eyes. The grandfather's laughter faltered, replaced by a sigh so deep it made the remaining air tremble. He understood in his way. There was no cycle in this, no renewal. The pariah force did not cleanse corruption. It erased the possibility of decay itself. The galaxy was being stripped of the emotions that fed him, the sorrow and sickness that wove his womb. Even death, his oldest companion, felt distant now, numbed by the encroaching void. Tzeentch writhed amidst the shards of his labyrinth. The crystalline towers that represented shifting destinies collapsed with every pulse from the pariah star. Futures he had shaped meticulously dissolved before they could take form. Timelines buckled and folded into nothingness. His 1,000 faces twisted, each contorted with expressions he had not worn in aeons: frustration, disbelief, and the cold edge of despair. He flung visions into the dark, searching for a thread he might seize, a path untouched by the nullification. Each attempt came back as blank stone. Each prophecy ended before it began. He tried to speak words of power. Each one returned to him as mute air. Even his own thoughts unraveled before completion. The architect of fate realized the truth. The pariah presence was not rewriting destiny. It was abolishing the concept. And in the palace of Slaanesh, silence reigned like a tyrant. The symphony of sensation, ecstasy, agony, yearning, release, had dimmed into a dull monotone. Sculptures that once shifted in perfect sensual harmony froze mid-contortion, their forms losing colour and texture. The Prince of Pleasure traced a hand along a velvet wall, only to feel nothing. Not softness, not warmth, nothing. Desperation, once sweet, now tasted like ash. Slaanesh craved emotion, the smallest spark of desire or revulsion, But the pariah star's heartbeat devoured them all. Even temptation faded. The realm of excess, built on the constant overflow of mortal emotion, starved. One by one, the chaos gods lifted their gazes to the edge of the dying Imperium, where the null light grew brighter with every pulse. They sensed the presence advancing toward the Emperor, but now they understood the deeper truth. The entity was not merely seeking him, it was seeking them. As the last great psychic beacons in a universe sliding toward emptiness, they were obstacles, remnants of a cosmic age, the pariah force intended to extinguish. Their thrones trembled, their halls cracked, their essences strained under the pressure of a force that negated psychic existence. They attempted to marshal what remained of their power. Khorne summoned legions of demons, but the warriors flickered like candle flames in a void, their forms half-formed and dissolving. Nurgle tried to unleash plagues, but the spores vanished before they reached air. Tzeentch hurled storms of metamorphic energy, but each spell collapsed into meaningless dust. Slaanesh reached out with tendrils of seduction, but even desire refused to obey. In the center of their unraveling dominions, the Chaos Gods felt a sensation they had inflicted countless times upon mortals. Powerlessness. The pariah star pulsed again. This time, its heartbeat echoed not just through the warp, but through the mental architecture of the gods themselves. A deep, hollow resonance tore through their realms. Khorne staggered. Nurgle groaned. Tzeentch cracked like a fractured mosaic. Slaanesh knelt, clutching the air as sensation bled from existence. The warp's surface tore open, not in a rift of color and madness, in a wound of absolute silence. Through it stepped a silhouette, a figure of impossible proportion, neither flesh nor spirit, shaped from the absence of all psychic resonance. It radiated no emotion, no thought, no presence, and yet its mere existence pressed upon the Imperium with crushing finality. The Chaos Gods recoiled instinctively. The being did not attack, it observed, and in its gaze, devoid of hatred, judgment, or recognition, the four felt themselves reduced to insignificant anomalies, for the pariah entity saw chaos not as enemies, but as errors. Its quiet step forward made the warp groan. Khorne swung his axe. Nurgle spread his rot. Tzeentch cast his last prophecy. Slaanesh reached for sensation. All four powers struck with the remnants of their existence. Their attacks passed through the figure as though through a shadow. For the being within the pariah star was not fighting them. It was simply erasing what should never have been. And as its presence deepened, the Emperor felt the warp groan with a single, universal truth. The age of gods was ending. The presence of the pariah entity drew closer, a ripple through the dying warp that could be felt even within the Golden Throne. Its null light reached out, probing, testing, and the Emperor felt it as a weight upon his essence, pressing against his centuries-long vigilance. The Astronomicon flickered beneath the strain, and every psychic thread woven into the Imperium shivered with an unfamiliar chill. It was no demonic assault. It was no psychic storm. It was a presence so absolute that the warp itself recoiled, leaving the Emperor to face it alone. He extended his awareness, probing the boundaries of the null light, seeking comprehension. The entity did not communicate. It did not attack. It existed as an absolute principle, older than chaos, older than mortal ambition. Its purpose radiated with clarity, the erasure of psychic phenomena, the death of demons, the collapse of the warp, the nullification of psychic life across the galaxy. It was not a god, though it moved through realms as a god would. It was something beyond divinity, something that operated by the simple fact of its existence. And now it sought him. The Emperor's will, honed through 10,000 years of sacrifice, pressed outward. He sought to contain it, to draw it into understanding, to anchor it. But the entity was not bound by reasoning or morality. It reacted only to presence, to force, to immutable will. The Emperor felt it stretching toward him, and with each pulse, he realized the stakes. If he failed to intervene, the null light would sweep the galaxy entirely, leaving humanity as flesh without soul, as civilization without destiny. He opened a conduit through the Astronomicon, pouring every shred of psychic essence he still commanded into the narrow corridor connecting Terra to the pariah star. His voice, silent and resonant, reached across the void, calling not with sound, but with purpose, with intention, with the weight of creation itself. Yet the entity responded with perfect stillness, absorbing and negating all that touched it. Its null light pressed upon him like an ocean crushing against a cliff, and he felt the impossibility of resistance. He shifted, focusing on the thread that connected the entity to the dying warp. There, he discerned an origin point, a locus of existence prior to all recorded history, predating even the Old One's experiments, predating the first tremor that birthed the Chaos Gods. The entity had lain dormant, encoded into the structure of reality itself, waiting for the proper alignment, a universe overloaded with psychic excess, a galaxy shaped by the caprices of mortals and gods alike. Its awakening was inevitable, a consequence of centuries-long imbalance, and yet it sought to engage him directly. The Emperor understood that it had sensed the pivot of his will, the force of choice required to determine the survival of the warp and of humanity itself. He drew upon the memory of his primarchs, recalling each resonance that remained, the echoes of Gilliman's discipline, Vulcan's warmth, Magnus's brilliance, Angron's fury now distorted and faint. Their destinies were intertwined with the warp, and the null light threatened to undo them. He sensed the tension between continuity and erasure, and he realized that he must act not simply to preserve himself, but to anchor the potential of all life still tied to psychic energy. The pariah presence advanced with deliberate inevitability. It did not hesitate, it did not falter. It moved as if reality had conspired to allow its path. And yet, the Emperor did not retreat. He extended his mind into the vast crumbling lattice of the warp, pushing his essence against the absence, planting fragments of order, fragments of command, fragments of resistance. His psychic pressure met the entity's null light, and for the first time, a subtle counter-vibration emerged, a feedback of intent that suggested interaction rather than annihilation. The Emperor probed further, threading his will through the void. He did not seek to destroy the pariah presence. Destruction was beyond his ability, beyond the construct of his universe-spanning consciousness. He sought understanding, containment, the smallest adjustment sufficient to preserve humanity while respecting the inevitability of the null force. He sensed the entity's logic, cold and absolute, and he mirrored it with human ingenuity, divine insight, and millennia of experience. Two forces, one driven by infinite purpose, the other by the weight of creation, met in the narrowing conduit. The interaction strained the Astronomicon to its limits. Entire fleets felt the subtle pull of energy not generated by light, gravity, or radiation. The Emperor's psychic pulse resonated across the void, not as commands or guidance, but as the subtle vibration of presence countered by presence. In the void where the warp had died, two singularities of will faced each other. One sought to erase, one sought to preserve. And then, as the pariah entity aligned closer, a fissure appeared in the null light, a momentary gap, subtle but undeniable. The Emperor detected it as a chance. If he could thread his will precisely with perfect concentration and absolute clarity, he could insert a stabilizing resonance into the entity, a tether that might preserve the warp without destroying the null force. It would require the full measure of his remaining psychic power, an extension of consciousness beyond the thresholds even the Golden Throne had previously supported. Failure would mean the immediate collapse of the warp and the annihilation of all psychic life. Success would leave the galaxy teetering between order and void, balanced on the edge of his decision. He inhaled the tension of the dying Imperium. He focused on the pulse of the pariah star. He extended his essence forward, threading a needle of thought through impossibility, guiding the ancient null force into coexistence with a universe still clinging to life. And in that instant, the Emperor understood the paradox of the moment. The being he faced was not an enemy, not a god, not a creature of malice. It was inevitability, and he alone could negotiate with inevitability. The Emperor's mind stretched taut against the pariah presence, threading impossibly thin lines of will through the collapsing warp. Null light pulsed around him like a tide of infinite consequence, swallowing everything in its path, while leaving no trace, no scream, no echo. The warp no longer roared. It no longer wept. It merely existed in absence, a silence that pressed like a blade against the foundations of reality itself. And from this silence emerged clarity. The pariah's purpose was absolute, its intent inevitable. Chaos would be erased. The warp would cease. All psychic phenomena, every trace of divine interference, would vanish. The Emperor weighed the consequences with the precision of 10 millennia and the burden of creation. Without chaos, demons would die. Psychic mutation would stall. Sorcery would be impossible. The galaxy might survive in the corporeal sense, but humanity would lose its soul, its potential, its connection to the divine resonance that had elevated it above mere flesh. The Imperium could continue, but only as a body without spirit, as a machine without flame. Civilizations would endure, star empires would persist, but the spark of evolution would dim into stagnation. He had built the Imperium to guide humanity through both peril and transcendence. But here was a future where both were impossible. Yet if he acted to halt the pariah, chaos would survive, demons would endure, and the cycle of corruption and suffering would persist indefinitely. The galaxy would bleed for 10,000 more years, perhaps 10 million, and every world would continue to bow under the shadow of psychic tyranny. Mortals would fight, suffer, and die in endless loops of war. The Imperium would endure, but at what cost? To preserve chaos was to preserve suffering. To allow the pariah's will was to preserve extinction, but perhaps the extinction necessary to cleanse corruption itself. He shifted his focus, threading his consciousness through the lattice of the dying Imperium, seeking balance where none existed. He traced the ripples of the pariah star across the warp, observing how every pulse aligned with the thinning of demon realms and the collapse of psychic tides. Khorne's rivers of blood had slowed to stagnation. Nurgle's gardens were still. Tzeentch's labyrinths fractured, and Slaaneish's echoes faded to flatness. The four were reduced to shadows, impotent against the inexorable principle moving toward perfection. They sensed him, the last anchor of the galaxy, and reacted with desperation, trying feebly to oppose the presence. But the pariah was not a war to fight. It was a law of nature asserting itself. indifferent to ambition, cruelty, or devotion. The emperor realized that the decision he faced was not one of simple preservation or destruction. It was a choice between two forms of existence: a universe alive with chaos and divine conflict, flawed but vibrant, or a universe cleansed of corruption, sterile but unchallenged. One path preserved freedom through struggle. The other preserved continuity through annihilation. And in that realization, he understood the paradox. The galaxy could not survive fully. It could only endure in shadow or in silence. He reached inward, drawing on the last reservoirs of his psychic essence, the stored will of 10 millennia of sacrifice. The golden throne, already weakened, quivered beneath his effort, its conduit straining under the pressure of sustaining both body and consciousness. The null light pulsed with every heartbeat of the pariah star, and he mirrored that pulse with intention, threading his will into its inexorable rhythm. The resonance was delicate, almost imperceptible, a single harmonic within a maelstrom of inevitability, but it was enough to establish contact. Through that harmonic, he offered the entity a choice, paradoxically, the only choice it could recognize. The pariah, a being beyond gods, beyond mortal thought, beyond psychic laws, could act only according to the principles that defined its existence: nullification. Yet within the weave of its purpose, the emperor introduced nuance, a tether to preserve certain echoes, to allow consciousness to remain within limited domains, to retain the potential for life while removing the destructive chaos of the warp. The thread was fine, fragile as spun glass, but it resonated. The pariah hesitated, sensing a principle within the emperor's will that aligned partially with its own: the preservation of order without the corruption of excess. For a moment, the galaxy held its breath. All across space, worlds that had feared the coming silence felt the faintest relief. Demons dwindled into shadow. Sorcery failed. Cultists and heretics felt their prayers unanswered. Yet astropaths and psychers, those who survived the thinning, sensed something enduring. The warp's depth had not returned, but the possibility for psychic existence, fragile and diminished, persisted. The Imperium would endure, not as it had been, not as he had dreamed, but without the gods, without chaos, without psychic omnipotence. Humanity would survive in flesh and spirit, stripped of divine interference, tempered in the crucible of existence. The emperor, bound within his throne, felt the last pulses of the pariah entity settle into equilibrium. It had accepted the tether, not through will, but through necessity. The galaxy, cleansed of chaos yet alive, balanced on the knife edge of his calculation. The warp was no longer vibrant. It was no longer chaotic. It was a tool once more, neutral, constrained, dangerous, and finite, but sufficient to allow life to continue. And in that silence, the emperor perceived the aftermath: a galaxy without gods, without demons, without divine conflict. The Imperium would struggle, adapt, and endure, but it would be alone. Faith would have meaning only to the living. Hope would rest on mortal endeavor, and the pariah star's presence would remain a constant, a sentinel beyond the edges of comprehension, ensuring that chaos could never rise again. For the first time in 10,000 years, the emperor felt a measure of peace. Not triumph, not relief, not victory, but clarity. The decision, born of sacrifice and insight, had preserved a fragile equilibrium. The galaxy would exist, yet never as it had before. The choice was made. The pariah's will and his own had intersected, forming a new order, a future free of gods, free of chaos, free of the warp's corrupting influence. but still alive, still capable of growth. And as the pariah star pulsed one final time, the Emperor's consciousness stretched through the throne and beyond the dying Imperium, sensing the faint heartbeat of a galaxy reborn in silence, ready to endure the age without gods. The galaxy trembled under the weight of the choice the Emperor had made. Across trillions of worlds, stars burned and systems rotated in silent witness to the end of an epoch. The warp, once a living, writhing ocean, now shimmered only faintly, its tides measured, its chaos extinguished. Demons, the ruinous powers, and all forms of psychic corruption had been reduced to memory, their influence erased as though they had never existed. The pariah star pulsed faintly at the edge of known space, no longer a threat but a sentinel, a cosmic proof that the balance had been enforced and the galaxy recalibrated. Yet the Imperium, though spared from annihilation, was irrevocably changed. Faith, once the lifeblood of civilizations, had become a tool rather than a divine mandate. The ecclesiarchy, shattered by the revelation that their miracles were bound not to gods, but to the necessity of the warp, rebuilt with pragmatism. Cathedrals still rose, but they spoke less of angels and demons and more of mankind's endurance, its discipline, and its duty to the living. On Terra, the priests and philosophers debated openly, for there was no psychic censorship, no invisible hand of divinity to punish heresy. The imperial truth, once suppressed, now spread openly, tempered by the Emperor's unseen guidance. Humanity would shape its destiny through intellect and labor rather than prophecy and fear. The Primarchs, too, emerged altered by the collapse of the warp and the absence of chaos. Those who had survived within the echoes of the dying Imperium returned to the material universe with clarity and purpose. Their legacies were no longer corrupted by the manipulations of Tzeentch or the indulgences of Slaanesh. Angron's fury remained, but it was disciplined. Conrad Kurz's visions, once twisted by despair, now reflected only truth. Magnus the Red carried knowledge of the warp, but wielded it without the distortions that had doomed his legion. Each son of the Emperor became a living embodiment of potential unspoiled by divine interference, instruments not of the god's whim, but of humanity's enduring will. Yet the galaxy itself felt hollow, not in destruction, but in absence. The pariah star's influence had erased more than chaos. It had removed the spiritual scaffolding upon which civilizations had relied. Mortals survived, but they no longer reached outward for divine guidance. Dreams were untainted but also unilluminated. Curiosity unshaped by necessity. It was a galaxy of consequence, not of divinity, of survival, not transcendence. Every world, every empire, every civilization was left to stand upon its own merits, guided only by the careful touch of the Emperor's remaining influence and the silent watch of the pariah star. The Tyranids, whose advance had once threatened unchecked devastation, now found the galaxy fundamentally different. Without the psychic tapestry that had allowed the hive mind to locate and manipulate prey, their assaults became inefficient. They consumed matter, yes, but the loss of the warp's depth stripped them of the subtle awareness that had made them unstoppable. Fleets scattered, hunting blindly in a universe now flattened of psychic nuance. The Emperor, observing from the golden throne, knew their hunger remained, but it was constrained. The galaxy could endure. Even the Necrons, whose dynasties had stirred beneath the weight of null light, adjusted to the new order. Tomb worlds awoke with purpose, not malice. Dynasties recalibrated their logic in alignment with a cosmos no longer teeming with unpredictable psychic turbulence. Some recognized the pariah star's principle as a tool to preserve cosmic stability. Others hesitated, wary of a power beyond their understanding. For all their ancient designs, the galaxy now moved according to laws older than their dynasties, laws even they could not fully control. The Emperor, seated upon the golden throne, surveyed all of it in silence. He felt the fading pulse of the pariah star at the edge of perception, steady and impartial, and he understood that his role had shifted. No longer merely a ruler, no longer merely a guide, he was now the guardian of a fragile equilibrium. The galaxy would endure, but it would be forced to do so without gods, without chaos, without the constant tension that had shaped 10,000 years of history. It was a triumph wrought through impossibility, but it was a victory nonetheless. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, a question lingered. The pariah star had ensured that chaos could not return, that psychic phenomena would persist only within the strict limits imposed by its presence and the Emperor's tethering influence. But the galaxy, free from divine manipulation, now carried the weight of its own choices. Mortals could flourish or fail. Civilizations could rise or collapse, and the stars themselves would bear witness without divine adjudication. The ultimate test of the Emperor's long struggle had shifted from cosmic warfare to the quiet perseverance of mortal will. Across the Imperium, life adjusted. Hive cities rebuilt under new directives. Shipyards resumed production, not for holy crusades against demonic invaders, but for exploration, defense, and survival. Worlds once lost to superstition and chaos now embraced practical governance, guided by reason tempered with experience. Education, trade, and philosophy flourished where doctrine had once reigned supreme. Humanity was no longer a species under siege by gods or demons. It was a species of consequence, unshackled from divine interference, yet burdened with the responsibility of its own endurance. In the eye's silent immensity of space, the pariah star pulsed one final time before settling into a steady rhythm, no longer a force of active destruction, but a guardian principle. Its light, neutral and unyielding, became a cosmic constant, a reminder of the decision that had reshaped the galaxy. The Emperor sensed the balance established, the threads of causality rewoven, the timeline stabilized. He had acted at the fulcrum of inevitability and choice, and the galaxy had survived, transformed, tested, and tempered by fire and silence alike. And so the universe, cleansed of gods and demons, of chaos and divine caprice, endured. The stars burned, civilizations struggled, and life persisted, guided now by mortal hands and tempered by the silent, watchful presence of the pariah star. The war had ended, not in victory or defeat, but in the quiet recalibration of fate itself. Reality, rewritten in flame and silence, had survived. And the Emperor, seated upon the golden throne, felt the weight of eternity settle into the stillness of a galaxy without gods.